if you've been using CakePHP and DebugKit, you'll be very familiar with this screen. Basically, it's just telling you where in the code an error has occurred, gives you all the stack frames so you can go back and see the trail of destruction that's been rent. And if I hover over this link, you can see in the bottom left hand corner of the screen that you've got PHP storm URL, and clicking on it in VS Code does absolutely nothing when running VS Code because it's not available. So what we're going to do, we're going to open up config bootstrap and VS Code enable that part of our setup. So if we look at the debugging documentation under editor integration, it says you can just set the editor as VS Code. So let's do that. And now we trigger our error again, and we now hover over it and we get a link to a file. So if you were developing directly in Windows, this would probably be correct, and then you'd click on it and go open, but in this case we're inside a Docker container inside Windows Subsystem for Linux. So we're going to look at two ways of doing this. So you'll get this error message if you try this and you say okay, but nothing works. So now we're going to have a look at getting it Windows Subsystem for Linux enabled. Now, just getting fully out of WSL and back in, if I go to where my source code is, this is where it's at. So that's inside Windows Subsystem for Linux. That's where my source code is being stored. And what we want to be able to do is click on this link here and then open that in Windows Subsystem for Linux. So let's make that work to start with. Now in the documentation it says you can add an editor and customize it a bit. So what we're going to do, we're going to comment this one out, and we're going to create a WSL configuration. And in this case, what we want is, right, we're just getting a few error messages there out of the way. What we're going to do is create a different URL here. So it's VS Code, and then the secret source is VS Code -remote. And then we need to say, okay, it's a WSL URL, and we need to then specify which which WSL instance is being run. So we just get out of here and go WSL and list, and we can see that our default WSL is Ubuntu 2204. So let's go, sorry, it just jumped out of the way there. So let's go and put that in there. And then have we done enough? I don't think so. I think that's not how it normally works. Let's have a look at the URL again. So wait for it to expand. Yeah, we need a colon, not this here. So we need the file and then we need a colon, and then that should be correct. Now let's have a look at that and see what's happening. When we reload, we can see when we hover over it, we've got nothing like we expected. Why is that? Well, we need to go back in and run this command here to set the editor to this new configuration. So once we've done that, let's re-trigger our error, hover over it. We can see now we've got a VS Code enabled URL there. Now let's see what happens. And basically something's failed. Unknown distro. So that's an interesting error message. Let's go back and find out why Might just close that as well. Unknown distro, and we've got an equal sign that shouldn't be there. And try again. We go open again. Now it's going to open the distro, and then it's going to fail because it's not where it needs to be in the path there. So we're going to now make another change to make sure. So from within Windows Subsystem for Linux, we remember that our code is here. So we really need to make a change to our configuration here. So what we might do is just do a file replace here. So we're going to replace the root and remove it and replace it with nothing. And then we're going to say, okay, within WSL, the path to our code is this. And so we'll replace the root path in the WSL or with the prefix here. Now this is just to show you the problems that would come up and how to get around them a bit. You'll have to edit this to make it work for your environment, of course. But now you can see that we've connected to WSL, we've opened the file at the line that's specified in the URL, and then we can do something like, okay, let's collapse everything and just look at where that error was occurred in our code, and then we can click on and then see and go, oh, okay, this is where our issue is happening. So we can see that that's how we get VSCode to open a file within a WSL instance, but we're not using WSL exactly. What we're using, if we have a look down here, within here, I'm developing inside a container that is just another step further. So you've got WSL and then you've got the container. So we need to now figure out how do we configure our debug kit so that it works inside this container. So that's the next step. So let's comment out that configuration. And now we're going to add another configuration, but this time we might, we'll type it, yeah, debugger, add an editor. We're going to call this the Docker configuration. Same again, file and line number. And this time, what we need to do is we need to make a very special configuration. So it's been coding in JavaScript for the last few weeks, so that's why the curly braces made an appearance. But container name, and notice here we're in the containers here. Container is WMS PHP-1, so I'm just going to put that in as the container name. And then once that's done, I'm going to convert it to JSON encode, and once it's encoded, I'm going to make it into hex, bin to hex, and then we now have the container in the right format so that we can, so we go VSCode, same again, VSCode remote. This time we're wanting, it's a container that's already attached. There's another way you can specify this dev container, and I think that will try and start your dev container that you specify, but this one is attached ed container, and then we just pass it the name of the container in hex format, then we say, okay, because we're inside a container, and we go File, and then finally line. Now this will now, after we go debugger set the editor to be the Docker editor, will now give us our full ability to open up, and we're just going to trigger our error again. Notice here, if we wait for the URL to expand, you can see that we've got a hex string that signifies the particular running container, then the full link to the file. Let's click on it and see what happens. And there we have opening in our development environment. Going back to here again, we can see, if we wait for a moment, we can see that we now have full clickability into VSCode, which is really cool. So let's have a look at this error. So what is happening with this error? Well, this is something I discovered today. I'm following the documentation, and I'm using Postgres as the database server, and for some reason it just doesn't like this. I'll probably have to log a request or something to get it looked at. But what do you do when things just don't work? Well, dump and die the query, and once you do that, you can see, well, okay, this SQL could not be generated as it is incomplete. No matter what I tried, I couldn't get it to work. So plan B. So how do we go about plan B? Well, sometimes you can find a way to do, so this date diff, you can find a way to do something as a workaround. So in this case, I'm just using the extract function and passing it what I need it to do. I want to extract the day value after I've subtracted now from the best before date. So all this now allows me to continue on, even though I ran into a brick wall. So here we can see that when we dump and die this particular query, that it's now creating properly formed SQL, and we've worked around the particular problem that we found. And ultimately, if we just have a look at run the query, we can see that all the expressions and the SQL code that we created to make it do what it needed to do is now working. So I hope these small ideas are helpful to someone.